Good evening, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to the Power Keywords lecture by Professor John Harris. My name's Craig Jeffrey. I'm a director of the Australia-India Institute. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people, and pay respects to their elders past and present. I also extend a special welcome to any Aboriginal people who are in the audience this evening. It is a huge honour to be welcoming someone of the stature of Professor John Harris, who, I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying, has for several decades been one of the most, if not the foremost voice in development studies and in the political anthropology of India globally. It's no surprise that we have a full house this evening, and I'm also delighted that we have an hour and a half this evening to interact with John. He'll be speaking for 45 minutes, and then we'll have 45 minutes for questions. This, of course, a critically interesting time to be thinking about issues of power and politics in India, and I anticipate a lively series of questions and Q&A in a moment. Now, John became interested in the anthropology of India during an overland trip he took from the UK to India in the late 1960s, when he noticed, and what I think was partly very interesting about this trip, is that he noticed that the landscape in South Asia was being transformed at that time through the introduction of modern forms of agricultural technology, the so-called Green Revolution. And that, as well as the intellectual environment in which he was working in Cambridge University at the time, inspired him to go and do in-depth, long-term field research, the type of field research, sadly, which I don't think is happening so much these days in South Asia, on agricultural production, agricultural labour relations in India and Sri Lanka. And this led to a pioneering monograph, an absolutely landmark work on agricultural production relations, published in 1982, which also, I think, provides some very interesting perspectives on issues of caste, kinship and social relations in rural South Asia, and remains a key text for students and scholars today. Since that time, John has retained a very strong interest in agrarian change, and one of the superb qualities of John as an intellectual and of his academic career has been, I think, his determination and commitment to following through an intellectual agenda in South Asia. He's one of the people, I think, who demonstrates a phrase that I often bandy around in these kinds of settings, a commitment to place, a commitment to really following through and understanding in all their changing complexity a set of social and political questions. Agrarian change, agricultural production relations, the plight of the poor have been common themes through work that John has been doing since the 1960s in South Asia. Again, we're really privileged, John, to have you here to talk about those things this evening. But John's also gone in other directions, reflecting his own changing interests and also the changing nature of South Asia. I'm not going to be able to list all of those projects. Many of you in the room will know them perhaps better than I do. One has focused on the sociology of labour markets and has focused on the industrial city of Coimbatore. A second body of research has focused on trust and social capital. A really fantastic set of work that led also to a book on social capital and the World Bank that has become extremely influential in development studies and more broadly. A third body of work has focused on civil society and urban politics in Delhi and Chennai. He's also recently been working on the politics of business in Tamil Nadu. So an extraordinary range of themes. What many of you who have read John Harris's work will also recognise is his luminous intelligence and his absolute dedication to explaining clearly and without dressing up his work, I think, in verbose, unnecessary theoretical language, a core set of important intellectual and substantive questions. Throughout my own career, John has been a kind friend, a great guide and mentor, as well as a towering intellectual lodestar in the firmament. So without storying him in his presence, as Shakespeare might put it, to any further, I would like to invite John to take the stage to deliver the Power Lecture, and I'd like you to extend a warm welcome to him.
Right. Well, I just hope I live up to that billing. It's very, very difficult, I think. I'm not quite sure I recognize the person who Craig was talking about. But thank you, Craig, very much for that very, very generous introduction. Thank you also and thank you to express my thanks to the Institute for the opportunity of being here. I have to say I welcome any excuse for coming to Australia. Had I had the good fortune to have come to Australia much earlier in my life, I would never have left. As it is, I just take advantage of opportunities like this, so thank you very much for having me. I also had the tremendous pleasure earlier today of interacting with the younger research scholars in the Australia-India Institute. And in the light of that discussion, I felt I really wanted to go away and rewrite really what I'd planned to say this evening. But I'm not quite quick enough on my feet to do that. Perhaps there'll be a chance for me to modify perhaps a little bit some of the things I want to say in the course of question and answer, the discussion afterwards. Okay, try to keep an eye on the time. A few weeks ago, I had the very good fortune to listen to a lecture given by the former civil servant, diplomat and scholar Gopal Krishna Gandhi on a topic quite close to mine. Gandhi spoke to the theme, who rules India? The panchayats, the government, the judiciary, or Nota? In other words, where does power lie in India today? Gandhi's answer was Nota, none of the above. And he argued that India is now ruled by three forces: by fear, by distrust, and by money. The idea that power in India today lies with money is implicit in a project in which I've been engaged recently with Atul Kohli at Princeton and other scholars. Kohli's argued that the enhanced role of business groups in politics in India's developmental states, such especially as Gujarat, and now in the time of the Modi government at the centre, means that these groups are able to use their power to influence state behaviour in a way that was not true before. Kohli has proposed that, I quote him, at the heart of India's new model of development, which is focused on the goal of growth promotion via support for private enterprise, is the enhanced role of business groups in politics. With economic success, the power and influence of business groups has grown enormously. Business groups now use this power to mould state behaviour. Is this true? My own research on the question in Tamil Nadu leads me to question the idea that business groups, their structural power notwithstanding, are actually moulding state behaviour. With the exception of a very few companies, major corporates based in Chennai are not important funders of political parties, and political financing depends on resources derived from activities such as real estate dealing, construction, quarrying, sand mining, and the liquor industry, much of it under the immediate control of local politicians. Money talks, for sure, but it isn't the money of big business groups. And in Chennai, the major companies have been more subject to the whims and dictates of successive chief ministers than they have been able to mould them. But there is no doubt that money power is hugely significant in India today. Milan Vaishnav's recent book, When Crime Pays, Money and Muscle in Indian Politics, amply confirms this. He tells us that one can walk almost the whole way from Mumbai to Kolkata without stepping outside a constituency whose MP isn't facing a criminal charge. The link between crime and politics is in significant part because of the costs of financing elections. But office, once won, of course, turns out to be highly lucrative. One recent study showed that the average wealth of legislators increased by 222% over just one term of office. A good many of these criminal legislators are out-and-out thugs with serious charges standing against them. Money and fear are closely aligned. Money power certainly played a part in the triumph of Narendra Modi in the Indian national elections of 2014. Some of the estimates of the amount of money he was able to spend on the election campaign suggest that it rivaled the sorts of sums spent on presidential campaigns in the United States. Since his election, however, and the results of the UP elections notwithstanding, he's not been all that successful in following through on promises made to business interests. Think of the difficulties that his government has run into over the amendment of the Land Acquisition Act passed under the previous government, or over the institution of the Goods and Services Tax. His rule has been marked by autocratic methods and, on the part of many, by fear and distrust. Yet Modi himself continues to command widespread and firm support. What does his career have to tell us about the nature of power in India? I'll return to the themes that I've sort of touched on in these introductory remarks in the course of the lecture. First, though, I think I should step back to consider, just briefly, concepts of power in general and in Indian society and culture. In doing so, I want to argue against the idea that there's something different about Indian society and politics because power is encompassed by religion. That leads me to discuss the significance of danda, a word found in several Indian languages and meaning literally the stick, but understood to mean force in Indian politics today. I'll talk too about what's referred to in classical sources as dandaniti, the use of force for the preservation of social order, and how this influences Indian political culture. And in conclusion, I'll return briefly to the question of where power lies in India today. Power in English is a polyvalent word, and definitions of it cover a good many pages in the Oxford English Dictionary. At its core, I think, is the idea of strength and of the ability to act or affect something strongly, and beyond this, of control or authority over others. Putting it more fully, power in society is the capacity to direct or influence the power of others. These are the senses of the word that have been elaborated by social scientists. Classically by Max Weber, who says, I quote him, power, or Macht, is the probability that one actor within a social relationship will be in a position to carry out his own will despite resistance, regardless of the basis on which this probability rests. The basis of the probability may be direct, as when one actor is able to coerce the other into compliance with her will. Or it may be achieved by what the OED refers to as influence, which includes the capacity to keep an issue off the decision-making agenda or out of the arena of conflict. When imperative control, as Weber calls it, is accepted by others as legitimate, as it may be for a variety of reasons, he refers to it as authority. Sorry, all that's probably absolutely familiar to everybody here, but let's just remind ourselves of that. It's time to return to India. How far do these ideas from Western social science have purchase in a different cultural context? There is an important body of thought holding that India is fundamentally different from the West, and that power is conceptualized quite differently from the ways in which it is in the West. There are a number of words in Sanskrit and in other Indian languages that have the meaning of power with one or another connotation. Our English language, by comparison, seems rather devoid of such subtlety. I'll focus my attention on two concepts of power from Sanskrit. Shakti, which I understand to mean the power, the potency or activating energy, not political power of domination, the power that is incarnated in goddesses. And danda, which, as I said, means stick and refers to the idea of force, or precisely the political power of domination. I'll talk mostly about danda, but I will make a brief reference to the significance of the idea of power as Shakti. In modern writing, the argument that Indian thought about power is fundamentally different from that of the West is articulated most forcefully in Louis Dumont's Homo Hierarchicus, the caste system and its implications. Strikingly, Dumont says virtually nothing about Shakti. The book's a lot about religion, as many of you will know, but he says very little, nothing actually, about Shakti. And he devotes his attention to danda. His argument is, of course, that the underlying structure of Hindu thought and action is the opposition of purity and pollution, the pure and the impure. This accounts for the hierarchy in social relations, the hierarchy that may be mapped out in what's observed in the commensal relations between groups, the rules about which groups will take and which receive different kinds of food from others. It's the concern about purity and pollution that accounts for the separation between groups given by endogamy and rules about kinship and marriage, and by occupational specialization. It's the fundamental concern with purity that accounts, according to Dumont, for the supremacy of the Brahman, the priestly castes, in the social hierarchy. And so Dumont argues, in Hindu thought and action, religion encompasses power. Force is made legitimate, he says, by being subordinated hierarchically to the Brahman, to spiritual force, and the Brahmins, the priests. Elsewhere he speaks bluntly of the devaluation of power. And according to this line of thinking, it is caste, not the state, which holds society together. The state is seen as having been really epiphenomenal. It is in many ways a compelling theory. Even so formidable a public intellectual as Francis Fukuyama seems to have found it so. The chapters on India in his book on the origins of political order take as axiomatic the idea of the separation of secular and religious authority. And he says emphatically that the social categories of Varna and Jati, caste categories that is, form the bedrock organization of society and severely limited the power of the state to penetrate and control it. Other scholars as well think that this substantially explains India's history of political fragmentation. I can't resist inserting a little aside here. My very good friend, the anthropologist Chris Fuller, with whom I discussed this lecture, read that paragraph and he commented, "This is normal, isn't it?" He said, "Big thinkers read other big thinkers and ignore the countless little thinkers who've proved them wrong." I rather like that. Sorry, I'll just take a quick swig. And Dumont's argument about the relations of Brahman and Kshatriya, or king, has not gone unchallenged among Indologists. Others have argued just as emphatically that the political element was not subordinated to the religious, and that Brahman and Kshatriya are part of an integrated religious political system. That's the argument developed by Nicholas Dirks in his ethno-historical research on a little kingdom of South India that leads him to insist that there's no ontological separation of the religious from the political. Religion, he says, does not encompass kingship any more than kingship encompasses religion. There are not two distinct forms of power. Now, it seems to me that Dumont's explanation of Hindu ideology can be found persuasive, but it's certainly ahistorical. The caste system in Dumont's conceptualization of it is an unchanging structure, at least until the recent past, when he allows that its character has changed fundamentally as castes have become, he puts it, they've become substantialized. They have become much more like ethnic groups competing with each other rather than being interdependent. With his admission of the possibility of substantialization, I think that Dumont finally allows that the play of material forces and of power relations do shape the practices of caste. And the historian Susan Bailey has shown that the emergence of what has been thought of as traditional caste society is in fact comparatively recent, being the outcome of changes that took place in India in the 18th and early 19th centuries. The formation of a far more caste-conscious social order took shape, she says, above all in the proliferating regional kingdoms of the post-Mughal period, when rulers, whether Hindu or not, found it to their advantage to deploy religious values in ordering and classifying the people over whom they ruled. By the end of the 19th century, she says, both the experience and the ideology of caste had undergone far-reaching changes, of which the most dramatic was the expansion and the rigidification of the pollution barrier. In the context of colonial rule, rural elites experienced unprecedented insecurities, and one response was for them to turn to the language and the practices of purity and pollution in consolidating their hold over the numerous labourers, many of them, certainly in Tamil Nadu, employed and living in conditions of absolute slavery. They hadn't been thought of until this time as unclean pollution removers. Bailey notes that in areas of high cultivation, such as Malabar, the eastern Gangetic Plain and the delta region of Tamil Nadu, there were two groups of lowly people. There were the specialists, such as the washermen and the barbers, whose tasks had to do with the removal of polluting substance. But there were also much larger groups of dependent labourers. Those who fell into this second category came to be described as untouchable, those whom we call Dalits these days. Caste as a system was then held to designate these people as permanently unclean and impure by virtue of the defiling labour they performed, not as free labourers, but as providers of obligatory service to landed proprietors. The practices of untouchability, therefore, reflect the exercise and the consolidation of power, of force. And the abolition of slavery, as late as 1843 in India, did little to change the conditions of unfreedom in which many laboured. Like the 40 so-called attached labourers, or padiyals, who worked for the village headman in the Tamil village of Iruvelpattu, bound to him by debt that could be inherited over generations, according to the account of the village in 1916, given by a man called Gilbert Slater. Peter Mayer, more recently, Peter Mayer of the University of Adelaide, says of the term padiyal that it appears to have come into being only following the outlawing of slavery in India. Then, he says, the untouchables were effectively re-enslaved through the kind of debt bondage that was observed 100 years ago and much more recently in Iruvelpattu. This actually new form of labour relationship, Peter says, rapidly came to be seen as traditional. We see here the significance both of coercive power in Indian rural society, danda, and of indebtedness, the two frequently tied together, even though they may have been wrapped up in the moral idiom of patronage, about which I have a bit more to say later. Patronage in the traditional village community may indeed have meant, as some anthropologists have argued, that some limited degree of security was ensured for the landless and the little landed through customary obligations and ties of personal dependence. It's clear that these relationships were underlain by differences of power and status, but couched in a particular moral idiom. The notion espoused by Fukuyama that caste, quote him again, that caste formed the bedrock organization of society and severely limited the power of the state to penetrate and control it, is also really falsified by historical evidence. The importance of the village as a unit of rural life has been shown to have been an artifact of colonial and pre-colonial governance, especially of an artifact of pre-colonial governance. Rather than existing prior to and outside the state, the village was largely constituted by pre-colonial Indian states. The Chicago anthropologist McKim Marriott, writing in 1955 in one of the first village studies in the modern anthropology of India, says, as far back as we're able to look, the social structures of little communities in the area of Indian civilization must have been profoundly affected by state land policy. The relationships of village communities with the state certainly varied. Roughly, when the state was strong, the village was under its thumb, and when it was weak, it wasn't. But villages with heads who were responsible to the rulers were convenient administrative units which delivered taxes and could be forced to render labour services. Sumit Guha, the historian Sumit Guha, makes the important point that the pooling of grain by villagers after harvest into the grain heap and then the division of it between the ruler, who took tax in kind, or the landlord, the cultivators and the village servants, which was supposed by Dumont to be a critically important marker of an economy governed by reciprocity and redistribution outside the market, actually came about in order to satisfy the landlord or the king's officers. Their concern was to ensure that nothing was concealed from them. Quite often, Guha points out, Even the commencement of harvesting had to wait on the landlord's or the government officer's permission. Threats and violence were a continual part of the process. The ubiquitous cudgel, he says, was rarely far away. So much for the harmonious, organic village community outside the state, supposed to have existed by Dumont and by others. In general, I think the significance of violence and coercion has been underrated in scholarship on India. Just finally, in this part of my talk, a word on Shakti. It's generally understood, as I said at the beginning, to refer to divine power. Susan Wadley, however, quite some time ago, showed in an ethnography from a North Indian village that in popular understanding, every item of the universe has its share of Shakti, understood neither as moral power alone nor as physical power, but as both together. This also implies, the argument is a little bit longer than I think I have time to develop, but the argument also implies that Shakti isn't separable from purity. And both power and purity are based on actions. So, according to the thinking of the villagers of Karimpur, wealth is an indication of a family's or a person's correct actions, indicating that their embodied powers, their Shakti, has increased. Shakti is obtained through right actions. And Wadley argues, just as men know which gods are powerful, have Shakti, by what and how many boons they can grant, so men know which men are powerful, by noting what they can do for other men on earth. It's possible, I want to suggest, that thinking of this kind influences how political leaders are regarded today. And so I really want to move on in the second half, I hope it is, of my talk, to talk a bit about power in contemporary in India and power in Indian political culture. Power relations are always related to structures of meaning that are the outcome of historical experience. We know, for example, that patron-client relations form the basis of political association in many societies. Yet this doesn't mean that the values of appropriate behavior for either patrons or clients are the same everywhere. So another way of putting the point that I'm making is to refer to differences of political culture. In the case of India, as Pam Price has argued in several significant articles, political culture reflects the influence of models of kingship, of Raja Dharma or Dandaniti, the latter meaning literally the conduct of punishment. Monarchs, of course, have to command force. They must dispose of the big stick, the danda. They have to have the power of punishment. But they also have the power to protect society, in the sense both of providing military defense and of providing protection of the social order. And there's another side to it as well. Kingly models also rest on the conviction that both individual and societal well-being is dependent upon acts of mercy and generosity from superior beings, both human and divine. In their persons and through their participation in the ritual observance of divine power, kings symbolized abundance and prosperity, and they were expected to distribute largesse in different forms to those who accepted their authority. This brief account of South Asian kingship is not, in fact, I think, all that different from Charles Tilley's analysis of the formation of the state in early modern Europe. Tilly describes the development of a kind of social contract between those whom he refers to as specialists in violence, the erstwhile landlords, and the producers of wealth. The model of Indian kingship is of a contract of this kind too, as A.L. Basham noted long ago in his classic, The Wonder That Was India. Where perhaps kingship in India was specific, in comparison with Western Europe, certainly, where rule depended more on bureaucracy, where kingship in India was specific was that it was segmentary. It was a status that was shared among greater and lesser ruling lords, extending down to the village headman. The idea and the practices of lordship, involving a focus on personal status and authority, have persisted through the colonial period right up to the present. One expression of this was in the dominance exercised locally by members of particular caste groups that, through their control over land, also exercised control over people. They were little kings and maybe claimed Kshatriya status. Dominance was supported by cosmologies that projected interdependence, though of an asymmetrical kind, in which the well-being of people and their families and communities required respectful subordination. Village lords, as I witnessed it when I lived in a Tamil village 40 years ago, ruled with the threat of force, but in the context of ideas of some degree of mutual respect between superior and inferior. The attitude on the parts of those subject to dominance was one among Tamil and Telugu speakers of Bhayam Bhakti, of fear, that is, combined with devotion or respect, the expectation that the Lord would supply protection and distribute largesse. I think the idea of Bhayam Bhakti, which Pam Price refers to as well, captures the tension inherent in the asymmetrical power relationship on which patronage rests, but also the moral idiom in which it's couched. As we know from the work, not least, of another Australian scholar, Oliver Mendelssohn, the ideas and practices of dominance have declined over the last 30 or more years. The erstwhile lords have very often turned away from the local arenas, sometimes giving up their lands, or even if not, moving away to towns. In some cases, like that of the Jats studied by Craig in Western UP, looking for employment outside agriculture, or in other situations, investing in businesses. This is rather to emphasize the pull of the urban economy. But there are also, and perhaps even more significantly, push factors. As I heard in the village of Iruvalputtu, when I did research there a century after Gilbert Slater, the Rediyars, who'd always been, though never numerous, the dominant caste of that region, had mostly left the village because they no longer commanded the respect of others and confronted what was described to me as the labour problem. In fact, by far enough, labour power was present in the village. The point was that labourers would no longer work the hours that had been customary, or more importantly, offer respect. Education, the increasing availability of employment outside the village, even if only on onerous terms, the availability of new sources of credit, electoral politics, all have contributed to much greater independence on the parts even of Dalits, and to a new fluidity in economic and social relations. Showing and receiving respect is still important, particularly on the part of those who seek public office. But as I go on to explain, money matters. The kingly model of authority, for all the decline of dominance, the kingly model of authority hasn't been entirely displaced, certainly in rural India. There remains a strong sense, shared by many people, that their livelihoods depend upon the personal willingness of those with power and authority, whether politicians or bureaucrats, to provide help. Turn to bureaucrats, politicians, not in positions they hold in the bureaucracy or state organizations, but not to them in their roles, their formal roles, but as persons. And people accept the personalized distribution of resources and services as legitimate. The point comes out clearly from a recent study by Ariel Ruud of the way that the National Employment Guarantee is working in West Bengal. There, his fieldwork was carried out very shortly before the left government fell in 2011. Party workers were very actively involved in the management of Narega, necessarily so, given the very limited manpower of the local administration in relation to the numbers of projects that had to be run. But this meant that the Panchayat ward that had voted for the opposition party in the previous local elections was getting pretty much nothing under Narega. People actually largely accepted that as legitimate. These guys weren't respectful, so, how could they possibly expect to get any benefits back from those in authority? Party activists did try to encourage people to recognize their right to work under Narega, and they saw it as a powerful counter to what they spoke of, using the English words as the feudal mentality that still persisted. In spite of their efforts, however, Ariel Ruud's interviews and observations clearly showed that most people still saw Narega as a welfare scheme supplied by a benevolent government, and sometimes spoke of it indeed in a way that evoked the idea of the benevolent patriarch who takes care of his subjects. Even the language that they used, the particular words they used, Ariel says, expressed supplication rather than the assertion of a right. And Ruud concluded that the state is not understood to be a servant of the people, and its officials are not seen as being under a legal obligation to provide services. Rather is the state seen in terms of sort of mutual obligation, protection and care given in return for loyalty and support in ways, frankly reminiscent of the Raja Dharma or kingly ideal that subjects employed in relation to monarchs. The people with whom Ruud lived then lived with a generally expressed sense of moral rights, rights to protection supplied by the powerful in return for loyalty, rather than a sense of the legal rights of universal citizenship. So, in the context of a society that's marked by pervasive material insecurity and deep inequality, in which the rights of citizenship for the great majority of people in the cities as much as in the villages are not easily claimed without the intermediation of powerful people, lordship remains significant in the ways in which power works. But as some scholars have argued recently, the ideal of the benevolent kingly protector is shifting increasingly to that of the violent protector, though I rather see these models as points on a continuum rather than as being radically distinct. As I said, this is in a context in which most people's experience is of increasing precariousness and of insecurity, associated in part with the malfunctioning and even the deterioration of political and bureaucratic institutions, not least the police force. And the terminology of violent protector comes from Lucia Michelutti, whose work on the Yadavs of North India, alongside that of Thomas Hansen on the Dada culture of Mumbai, has been seminal. Michelutti's work came, of course, as many of you will know, after the political scientist Yogendra Yadav had drawn attention to what he referred to as the second democratic upsurge in India, when political leaders from amongst the other backward classes sprang to prominence in the 1990s and overturned the historical dominance, certainly in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, of the forward castes. The most notable of these leaders were Mulayam Singh Yadav in UP and Lalu Prasad in Bihar. Michelutti's ethnographic and historical research explained the context of their power. A numerous and historically low-ranking caste cluster of people specializing in the herding of cattle and in dairying, those who now call themselves Yadavs have proclaimed their martial qualities, as they did to the British when they were seeking recruitment into the army in the later 19th century. And they value physical strength. Many younger Yadavs like to wrestle, and rather oddly in relation to meanings elsewhere in the world, milk drinking is associated with manliness because it helps to build the body that a wrestler needs. Appealing to divine kinship, Yadavs claim descent now from the popular deity Krishna, now generally accepted in UP, Michelutti tells us, as the original Yadav. But the Krishna to whom the Yadavs refer is a muscular deity. Yadavs, women as well as men, value a thuggish Gunda image. Having a tough reputation and a proven capacity for exercising violence bring together, Lucia says, the two long-valued potencies of a politician, to protect and provide. Mulayam and Lalu and other lesser Yadav leaders have been seen as semi-divine patron protectors. They also project an image of being men of action who can get things done for their people. And Indian politics generally are perhaps increasingly marked by the phenomenon, what some would like to call anyway, bossism. A reputation for crossing the bounds of normally accepted behavior, even of having committed murder, is a source of power. It's necessary to be seen as a virile, dominating person. Power has indeed all the time to be performed, even if not by murder, by the sort of behavior that I observed on the part of one of the village leaders in my village in Tamil Nadu years ago. Physically strong, this man, Dorasamy, was perfectly capable of beating up anyone who crossed him. In a society in which booze was generally frowned upon, he would organize drinking parties at the back of the village tea shop. His was a performance of power. He was small beer, of course, but in a modest way, he was a boss. One of the important stories of recent Indian politics is of mafia-style bosses drawing on muscle and gun power, who construct their own fiefdoms, making money in such activities as real estate, sand mining, quarrying, and so on, as well as through maybe dealing in drugs or being loan sharks. Like my old friend Dorasamy, in his small way, they may then enter politics. Getting into politics calls for money. And there are many ways of making money for those with muscle power. Dorasamy spent money on becoming panchayat chairman, and then made absolutely no secret, to me and others, of how much he made from contracts for work done in the village. At the same time, he made damn sure that the street lights worked in the Dalit colony, even when they didn't in the other village streets. His power base was among the Dalits. He had, therefore, something of a Robin Hood kind of an image, or that of a bandit king. And that's the style of a boss. Bosses have become increasingly important in Indian politics, supplying protection, physical and economic. Sorry, I'm going on a little longer than I'd intended to. Please forgive me. I'm nearly there, though. Bosses have become increasingly important in Indian politics, supplying protection, physical and economic, in the context of the increasingly violent society, which, of course, they have actually helped to create. Milan Vaishnav has shown that more than 1/5 of present MPs have charges standing against them for serious crimes, including murder. His argument is that local crooks used to bribe politicians to keep themselves out of trouble. But then, as politics became increasingly uncertain with the decline of the Congress Party, they started to promote themselves into holding office. What's perhaps most surprising in Vaishnav's analysis is the finding that candidates who've been charged with serious offences are 3 times as likely to win further parliamentary elections as those who have not. The reputation of being someone who can get things done goes a long way in the context of a polity in which the bureaucracy so often fails to deliver. It's generally true in India that given the inability of the system to deliver, politicians, even the most honest of them, may not consider good governance as feasible and certainly not as important for getting votes. One way of commanding votes is to have the reputation of being a tough guy who can call the shots. And criminal bosses also have the ability to contribute generously to party coffers, meeting the costs of expensive election campaigns. And so we have the contradiction, or one of the contradictions, of contemporary Indian politics. On the one hand, there's this very widespread complaint about the prevalence of corruption in politics, of criminality. And on the other, there are the evident attractions of muscular politics. I mean, how many of these guys who've been elected into office in UP over the last few weeks? An awful lot of these guys are, have criminal records and have, they're of this sort of gangster style that I've been talking about. Whatever its location on what I see as a kind of continuum between the models of benevolent, kingly, and violent protector, political leadership in India is highly personalized. The person of the leader is a focus of political activity. I've referred already to Lalu Prasad and to Mulayam Singh, the upstart backward class leaders from the Yadavs. Comparable figures, of course, are Mayawati, the leader of the Dalits in UP, and Mamata Banerjee in West Bengal. The personality cult around Mamata is symbolized by the blue and white paint and lights everywhere in Kolkata, as well as her picture everywhere, showing her as a sort of smiling auntie figure. Such leaders command political parties that may have little internal organization and certainly nothing remotely resembling internal party democracy. They are really the personal followings of their leaders. Then there are the titanic figures of Tamil politics. I mean, historically, the names may mean something to some of you. C.N. Anadure, M.G. Ramachandran, Jayalalitha, and Kalainar Karunanidhi, who's outlived the other 3. Such leaders inspire what Anastasia Piliavsky once called a moral logic of relatedness, reflected in the language of kinship that is often used in their regard. In Tamil, the word Anna, elder brother, is very commonly used in relation to political leaders. And the world now knows, of course, that Jayalalitha was Amma to Tamilians. She was mother, the benevolent protector, seen as giving and caring by many Tamilians. But she was also known to be strong, capable of meting out punishment quite ruthlessly and of demanding absolute loyalty. In a leader such as her, power, I think, has substance. There's a strong sense in which Jayalalitha had Shakti, according to the way in which Susan Wadley explained how this idea is popularly understood. It's consistent, too, with the way in which Lalu and Mulayam have been regarded amongst Yadavs. And of course, Narendra Modi has tremendous Shakti. In him, too, power has substance. He is the strong man with the 56-inch chest who will solve India's problems. He inspires both fear and devotion. I'm not sure that he would inspire the idea that he's elder brother. I don't know, maybe that's rather a specifically Tamilian kind of an idea. But Modi, as we've seen so clearly in recent weeks, is a master of the performance of power. Seen that so clearly over the issue of demonetization. That certainly caused considerable suffering amongst masses of poor people. But we now know very clearly from the outcome of the UP election that Modi personally has retained the support of very many of these poor people, because he successfully projected himself as the one who's placed his own person at risk by taking on the evil hoarders of black money, who are the enemies of the country. There's a sort of a moral force behind this projection. But still, I think Modi is more, in many ways, violent protector than the benevolent patriarch. By way of conclusion, sorry, it's been 50 minutes, not 45. I want to return to the question that Gopal Gandhi addressed. Who rules India? Or as I put it, where does power lie? My very short answer is that power lies with a political class that rules by some combination of populism and perhaps increasingly of program that is generally corrupt and frequently criminal. It commands money and rules by means of fear and patronage. Bhayam Bhakti, indeed. As Piliavsky says in her commentary on the recent collection, Patronage is Politics, the show of selfless munificence is as much a part of a gangster politician's work as it is of less violent policymakers. Another clearly very important part of how the political class wins legitimacy is by means of identity politics. The political leaders whom I've mentioned earlier, Mulayam and Lalu, Mayawati, Mamata, the leaders of the Dravidian parties in Tamil Nadu, and one could quickly add a good many others, all make appeals to different ethnicities with more or less well-developed ideologies. The big boss, Narendra Modi, though his own pitch has fairly consistently been that he's uniquely able to deliver on the agenda of vikas, of development, has a core of support amongst Hindu nationalists. He has henchmen who've carried forward the Hindu nationalist agenda with considerable speed since May 2014, with his sometimes tacit, sometimes more explicit support. And of course, it was very important that in these elections in Uttar Pradesh this year, the BJP fielded no Muslim candidates. And it was made very clear by Modi as well as by others that no, Muslims really had to know their place as sort of second-class Indians, as it were. Economically powerful groups, including even big business leaders, though they may have much more influence than others, have to compromise with this political class, and they don't always get their way. So I've taken a long and rather winding route to get back to Gopal Gandhi, with whom I started. My final words are that the prevalence of fear and distrust means that Indians seek protection and find it with political leaders who are the sorts of entrepreneurs that I've described. And that means, indeed, that there is a very important sense in India today that money rules. Thank you very much for listening. What happens now?
Thank you so much, John, for a typically superb presentation. We do have half an hour for questions. I know there will be a lot, and Ravi already has his hand up. But what I would just as a point of housekeeping, could you wait until the roving mic has reached you before you ask your question? And if you could also stand up and just say who you are, that would be very helpful as well. Cog, would you like to? Thanks.
Professor Harris, thank you for a very incisive tour de force of Indian politics. I think you may have missed two steps along the way. One was the 1979 Mandal Commission, which actually highly accentuated the caste divisions. And the second one was the Rajiv Gandhi becoming the Prime Minister in 1984, which led to ultimately the birth of massive corruption in politics. Those were, in my mind at least, those were two intermediate steps, right? But however, Shakti, Danda, money, right, in a large democracy or in large democracies are not different. If you look at India or if you compare it with Trump's United States, Trump is also wielding a Danda because his election was financed by extreme conservatives, extreme right-wingers in the United States, and whose consequences, whose policies he's enacting. Okay, but this is all known. How do you see the effect of urbanization on Indian politics in the future?
Should I, how do you want to do this? One at a time? Or?
Maybe one at a time.
Okay. Okay.
With a series of comments, and I think an interesting question at the end
Yeah.
about urbanisation.
Can I respond first to the comments? I think we really don't know. We have no basis for knowing whether there's more corruption now than there was in 1984 or in 1964. I mean, what I think we can be fairly certain of is that the discourse about corruption has become very much more prominent and forceful in the recent past, and I think that Rajiv's failure in the 1980s, to capitalize on that extraordinary election victory that he had following Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. He was looked to in the first sort of few months, first year really, after he took office, as being somebody who was going to sort of clean out the Augean stables, reform the Congress party, re-establish internal party democracy. He just failed totally in that. And I think there's no doubt that actually a lot of the cronies of younger brother, Sanjay, became more powerful in that period. But that's a detail. The impact of urbanization on politics. Well, I think that perhaps the one qualification which, in a sort of longer discussion, I would enter into some of the remarks I've made, would be to refer to what I see as the significance of the rise of the Aam Aadmi Party. I think, sadly, AAP has largely failed to deliver on what it promised. It's become far too much, built around the personality and so on of Kejriwal. But the two extraordinary election victories that ARP won, really, but of course especially the second one at the beginning of 2015, which depended upon a coming together of sort of the masses of the working poor and on significant fractions of the middle classes. Coming together partly over issues of corruption, partly, I think, over issues to do with, impartial governance and, the proper delivery of basic public services, is, I think, an indication of what can be achieved in the way of, if you will, a kind of progressive political alternative. However, it's at the moment, I think, a kind of political alternative which can exist in an urban context, but probably not in a rural context. Of course, maybe the fact that ARP got 4 MPs from Punjab, they've not done nearly as well as was expected in the Punjab elections this year, but they've got 22 seats, maybe give some reason for thinking that the ARP sort of idea can be projected outside the cities. But then, Punjab is a relatively urbanized state. Yeah, so I think that's my response. I think it's in towns where there's the possibility, of a somewhat different sort of politics.
We do have lots of people waiting to ask questions, so I'm afraid I'm not going to allow follow-ups as a thing. But I know
you just have to throw tomatoes.
Well, John will be around at the end, so you could maybe take an opportunity to talk to him then. Yes.
Just interested in what you might think of the social media, the impact of social media on politics, and especially the caste system, as people are starting to become more aware of their rights, and also globalisation making the world so much smaller.
I think that social media and media more generally, talking about this with some of the younger researchers in the Institute earlier today, it's a double sort of sided phenomenon. I mean, I think that it's possible to see potential uses of social media and of other the development of particular kind of messages in other forms of media as well as being supportive of people, claiming their rights under the new legislation, like the National Rural Employment Guarantee, the right to education, perhaps, the Food Security Act. But of course, there's the other side to it too, which is that social media and media more generally have been used, brilliantly by Modi as an individual and by under his inspiration by the BJP to project those ideas, like the idea that he was personally brave in going ahead with demonetization as a way of getting after the evil crooks, corrupt crooks who are destroying our country. The fact that, it is known that demonetization failed to expose lots of black money was clearly not recognized by the mass of voters in UP and indeed in other states in these elections. So, the sort of message that's put across through tweets, through the regular Man Ki Baat, broadcasts, can be very, very powerful in putting over particular ideas. I'm so sorry.
Sorry, why
Old geezer, hard of hearing. Can't.
Well, why is it not abolishing the dunda image that you talk about, that being so strong? Why would that still be so strong?
The importance of the dunda image.
Yeah.
I think it's, the idea of the strong man, I think is particularly the strong man who comes from outside the old political elite, the old political class. That Modi comes from, backward class. That he's not a sophisticated person who went to JNU and has a PhD sort of thing. But that he is a strong man who can get things done. That's one answer, I think, to the sorts of frustrations which are being felt in many different societies, with democratic politics, actually. I think of those guys who met in the plaza in Madrid, whose argument was, democracy doesn't really give us choice at all. We've just got politicians who are really indistinguishable from one another. In that sort of context, that sort of frustration with democratic politics, in some contexts, the strong man has a tremendous appeal, and I think that's the case that was the case in India in 2013, 2014. Until the BJP decided on Modi as the prime ministerial candidate, BJP wasn't really doing terribly well, against Congress in the polls, and I think it was the decision to bring Modi in as the candidate for prime minister that really turned things around. I'm sorry, I lost my own thread. And I should probably let somebody else speak now.
That's excellent. But Pradeep, and then there's questions over here. Yeah, Pradeep.
Pradeep Taneja from University of Melbourne here. Professor Harris, I'm curious why you did not use the concept of satta instead of, you use Shakti and Danda. But for those of us who come from the Hindi-speaking area, satta is a much more accurate sort of translation for power than Shakti. And secondly, there is one group, I think, which you overlooked in terms of having power, and that's all the gurus, the holy men. Mm-hmm. In the recent Punjab election, for example, almost every politician went to the more powerful gurus. The gurus have a lot of money. They don't have political power, but they have power over politicians. Yeah. So shouldn't they be considered as part of this discussion on power?
Those are good points. And I have to, admit that, I'm from the South. My language is Tamil, not Hindi, and I was very, very conscious of, I am very conscious of seeing things rather through South Indian languages and from the literature, which is perhaps to a significant extent developed from studies in South India. On the other hand, Sue Wadley's study, as you probably know, she did restudies of the village called Karimpur, which was studied by the Wisers back in the 1930s when they came up with the idea of the Jajmani system. Sue Wadley, working in Karimpur in the 1960s and into the 1970s, and more recently, certainly speaks a lot about the significance of the idea of Shakti amongst those North Indian villages. So, your other point about the significance of the guru, it's a little bit, I guess, go back to Dumont, the significance of the renouncer in the Hindu tradition. And yes, I think I accept that I I ran out. There was so much more I wanted to say, but I needed to give a course of lectures in the end, even to deliver on the abstract that I was asked to give before I'd started writing this lecture. But thank you very much for that. It is a very important point, I think.
Professor Harris, your analysis about the goings on for the last so many years has been really wonderful. But I want to only make a point, really not a question to you, that with the ills of the power, with the ills of the danda and all those things, India has come a long way to establish democracy, if you see in the context of the Southeast Asia as well as Asia. And that we cannot forget. Like you said about Modi's coming to power from a very humble background to this stage, and how he has won the elections in so many places. I look at the whole thing as even this caste, as somebody has put it, or the corruption, as it has put it. The more technology advances occurs, and more people get into the system of voting. Now we have seen the percentage of voting has increased over the years. So I feel India has stood a able democracy that also has to be really borne by everybody here in the hall. Thank you very much.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, the turnout, not sure what the turnout was in UP, but I happened to notice when I was just checking something earlier today that the turnout in these elections in Punjab was 77%. If we had 77% in the UK these days, maybe we wouldn't be condemned to endless one-party rule of the Conservative Party. You invite another whole kind of discussion of how democracy works, of the meanings of democracy in the Indian context. And I'm certainly not one to underestimate the significance of the meaning of democracy for masses of little people. Recent studies by anthropologists of elections show just how significant casting the vote is for many little people.
Another question, two more questions.
Hi, it's from Professor Harris. Just to get away from all the politics a bit. So I'm quite interested in the Indian culture is a high context culture, and their style of communication and sometimes can be quite problematic. So I'm just interested in what's the root of their way of communication, like quite indirect and inexplicit. So do you have like perhaps an emic perspective of that, and what's intrinsic into.
I'm so sorry. I'm not quite understanding the question.
Okay. Just the style of communication of Indian people is a high context culture. So why they
a high what culture?
High context.
High context culture.
Yeah.
It's a very much a business school.
Oh.
Basically high context, just being very indirect.
Very interactive.
Indirect. So, for example, a lot of people working in IT, and sometimes there's a project, and when you're dealing with Indian people, the way they refuse is they can't say sorry, I'm not interested, or I'm not available, and they say my family has some problems, I have to take care of my family. So that kind of thing. So cultural.
So you're talking about the sort of sense of an avoidance of potential conflict.
Not just the style of communication. Yeah.
I find that a difficult one. I'm not sure that I'm ready to venture generalizations about the style of communication. I come back, I think, I would just like to come back to what I said about the extent to which people in positions of some authority are appealed to as persons, rather than as functionaries or holders of particular positions. I think that's tremendously important. The sort of personalization of those sorts of relationships, and you see, I think, in many different interactions, the attempt to personalize. It's not specific to Indian society, I don't think. I mean, I think it's kind of, we all do it, but in relation to people who are in some sort of position of authority, I think there is something a little bit specific about, it's the expectation, that the guy is going to do it if I can in some way appeal to him personally, rather than by virtue of it being, my right as a citizen to expect that this should happen. That's really the point that I'm getting at.
Hi, I'm Charlie.
Charlie.
You spoke about Modi's rather effective performance of power. Would you be at all worried that Modi might perhaps use this image he has of the strong man to rattle the sabre, perhaps with Pakistan or China, and stir up some trouble in the South Asian region?
I mean, clearly, part of the Modi platform is that with him, India has achieved its rightful place in the world. It is one of the greater powers, if you will, at least. And so, India's military strength, I think, is extremely important to him. Though I don't know. I mean, I stand to be corrected by others here who know more about India's foreign policy positions and so on than I do. But my sense is it's not that he's brought anything terribly new or different to the table. It's a continuation, of what's been going on over quite a long time. I mean, the sort of contestation in terms of naval power in the Indian Ocean and around with China, and I don't think that there's any sense in which Modi wants to go to war with China, but he certainly wants to make it quite clear that India is not going to be pushed over. With regard to Pakistan, I doubt very much whether there's any deliberate, in spite of the kinds of things that some BJP leaders come up with. I really think it's unlikely. Again, please disagree, those of you who know more about this sort of stuff than I do. I think it's unlikely, Anthony, it's unlikely that India is going to seek a conflict with Pakistan. But it would never surprise me if a conflict were to break out because of the fragile nature of the relationship, the fragility really of the border. There's all the time the possibility of the escalation of one incident or another. But a deliberate going out to seek conflict, I don't think so.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Professor Harris, really liked your talk. And I would like to bring you back to the first question that you ran away from, and it's about big corporations and the market. And as much as you say that the small players are important in defining power, I would really like you to take up the question, because the big markets and big corporations do really influence India and politics. If you look at the top workings of the market, I think majority of them are still Brahmin dominated. And when it comes to the Ambanis and I guess the Jindals, they do matter so much. And I would really like to hear from you because I situate this question on the basis of your amazing work that you have done on governance, on development. So yeah, to the first question that you segued from.
I do accept that, I said very clear, very explicitly at the beginning when I referred to Atul Kohli's arguments about, big business groups molding politics. I said that my own perception of that in regard to Tamil Nadu says, no, I don't think the big guys, who are mostly Brahmins, contrary to the idea that the big businesses in Tamil Nadu are run mainly by Chettiars. Actually, the biggest business groups are there is a big Chettiar group, but the other big business groups are pretty well all Brahmin groups. And really those guys don't call the shots. They really are dependent upon to a significant extent, upon whether or not the chief minister, whether Jayalalitha or Karunanidhi, can be, they're interested in what the business groups are interested in. And you're right that maybe, thinking of the big business groups that supported Modi in Gujarat and that very substantially funded the election campaign. Perhaps those guys can, really call the shots. But, any political leader in India, Modi included, have to be concerned about the mass of the people. Modi had to go on television in March 2015 to speak to the farmers, because of the concerns amongst so many cultivators about land acquisition issues. And he had to really make a big point in one Man Ki Baat of saying to the farmers, I'm your friend. I'm not going to do anything that hurts your interests, and that is always okay. So, although subsidies that benefit primarily wealthier cultivators in Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, Andhra Pradesh in the main, have been reduced from where they used to be. They're still, a very significant part of government budgets. It's still reckoned by so many economists of different sort of stripes that the subsidy burden has to be cut. But cutting those subsidies is very, very difficult for any government. So, okay, I'm saying, right, I qualify, what I said because I do recognize that it's rather sort of South India, Tamil Nadu specific. And yes, there are big business groups that really do have a lot of clout, but their clout is always having to be in some way balanced against other interests, of which the interests of agriculture continue to be very significant, even if agriculture is now accounts for such a small share of GDP.
We have run out of time.
Sorry.
Anthony, if you could ask a very quick question, and John, if you could try to keep your answer. I'm sorry.
You've been too generous.
It's going to be a difficult question. You're going to have to answer it in a couple of sentences.
Anthony De Costa from the University of Melbourne. Since you ended with money, the first thing that occurred to me is, why not capital? In other words, why not use the word capital and therefore then work backwards to see how, let's say, the structural aspects of power then would somehow be tied to capital. Now, given your own work, let's say, in changing agrarian relations from a very early period of time, you would have seen certain kinds of changes where you could actually see that India was moving away from a quote-unquote non-capitalist, pre-capitalist, whichever label you want to use, to something more along the lines of capitalism. So does that sort of lend itself to thinking about the nature of power today in India, where you sort of tie it to actually capital and capital accumulation?
I'm talking about money.
Right.
I'm talking about money, not capital, as a relation,
yes.
or as stuff that gets invested. I'm talking about money, and the way in which money, the way in which money changes hands. So, I mean, I think one can develop an analysis to explain some of the phenomena that I'm talking about. One could develop an analysis of how this maybe is the outcome of particular ways in which capitalism works in the Indian context. But no, I'm not talking about capital, I'm talking about money.
We have to stop. I want to say one last time, John, thank you so much for travelling across the world, giving us this beautifully incisive synthesis and set of ideas, concepts, substantive points to think with. Knowing you'll be very pleased to hear from people who have further questions. Thank you so much again, and safe travels. Thank you.
Thank you very much.